for electricity there. You have demand and supply, but it's the merit order effect. Reinhard moved the supply curve. I find it easier to move the demand curve, the residual demand curves by variable amounts of wind. Prices come down. Generators don't make much money. Generators get unhappy. Generators close plant. Prices go back up, and if you've adjusted to the load duration curve again, everything becomes okay. So things, give or take a clicker, the load duration curve doesn't change much at the top, does change a lot at the bottom. Renewables tend to find themselves now concentrated in the hours where the net load duration is much lower, so they're going to get a relatively low price. And when the capacity, sooner or later, the capacity will adjust. Actually, that had something because it doesn't always adjust immediately. And prices stay low when it doesn't. And then we have a new set of equilibrium prices in which the remaining power stations can cover their costs quite nicely. You can see a bit of that in Great Britain. Capacity has been falling gradually over the last few years. Even despite that, load factors have been coming down. You can see the effect of the shale coal price, coal getting a much better load factor for the last couple of years, and then we finally got a sensible carbon price in the UK in the last couple of years, and coal got pushed right down. Even so, there's a pretty clear long-term trend of declining load factors despite the closures. Generators are not very keen on investing in large power stations at the moment. That's not yet a crisis. Well, it won't, because peak demand has been pretty flat in Great Britain. We still have a decent capacity margin, but nonetheless, there could be an issue coming up. Now, we've had a very low carbon Christmas recently, lots of renewables, nuclear, biomass, very, very little coal. And there have been a few times when we're actually producing more electricity than we wanted ourselves, and we actually exported it and paid other Europeans to take it. Please do not tell the British press that we are paying Europe to get out of something. They wouldn't like it. But then, the price day ahead hasn't been particularly volatile, but the price in real time has been more volatile. And if you think about supply and demand in this sort of market and price, this time I am moving supply. If you have too much supply, the price can easily crash down to zero. And over a year as a whole, we have some pretty volatile prices. And it's those peak prices that the generators need to get their remuneration. It's quite hard, perhaps, to see the difference between the coal and gas. Gas is slightly cheaper, so there's slightly more revenue. So let's magnify part of this. And, gas stations get this much revenue, the coal gets slightly less. And if I shrink it up, then you can see that a high proportion of the annual surplus that the generator's making over their marginal cost comes in not many hours. Those hours become quite important. That makes me feel life is going to be a bit risky. Do we need some sort of hedge? The best capacity markets can act as a kind of hedge. But actually, if I look at the data, if you look at load duration curves and then magnify it, you do get a lot of capacity between the very peak demand and the demand that you need running for 100 hours or so. But if you look over a number of years, you've got the amount, you don't have that much plant which is going to average 100, is going to be doing between 20 and 100 hours a year on average. You do have one or two very large peaks every couple of decades, and you have quite a bit of plant that might only be needed once a decade. And so the mean time that it would run for is 20 hours, but quite often it might not be needed at all in a year, and sometimes it might be needed for a couple of hundred hours in a very cold year. And that's using weather data and adjusted for long-term demands, no renewables. If I put in the current level of renewables in Great Britain, I need more very rarely used kit and pretty rarely used kit. Doesn't get much more risky. And if I have twice the amount of renewables, again, I need slightly more rarely used capacity, but the risks to its running time aren't that much greater. In other words, if we need a capacity market, we probably needed it in this world rather than because we've moved from this world to this world. And that's, I think, all I'll say about capacity at the moment. I want to think about a market of the future, and it's a model-based model. I've got a scheduling model with start costs. I realised a few years ago I'd been doing my modelling wrong for many years. I'd forgotten to give my models names, and we've now gradually thought of nice names for most of them, except this one we haven't got a good name for it. So it's just got to be the model with no name for the moment. Model without, and that was allowing me to distract you. In fact, I'm not doing proper inter-dispatch. I'm assuming capacity is divisible. Reserve requirement, demands from the profile, linear demand curves. I'm using Ian Stafel and Stefan Feniger's renewables profiles, which anyone else can get from the Ninja. That's a website. Assuming quite a lot of wind. Some really pretty high figures, but just to prove a point. And if you have a week with not that much renewable output, given the scale of capacity I've put in, so a lot of gas and quite a lot of peaking, then the prices will eventually reveal themselves, I hope, to be pretty spiky. Don't take too much into the absolute level of the numbers. These are just sort of scenario to prove patterns. If I take a week with very large amounts of renewable generation, very windy and not too bad for sun, even for the UK, I find that I really hope the conference centre is going to give you a refund for their IT, Reinhard. I then find I'm having to throw away some of my renewable output, and when I do, the price goes negative, because under the current subsidy system in the UK, you can claim back the subsidy from the market, or effectively you only agree to be constrained off if the market price goes negative, or if you get paid for doing so. It means that average revenues may be like that. Gas does better than average. Peakers do very well, but of course they don't do very well very often. Solar does less well. Wind does less well. And that is relevant for the question of whether the wind can ever be successfully, or the renewables can successfully be non-subsidised. And we have very volatile prices. But there are places with less volatile prices. This curve, I think, just by eye, looks a bit less volatile, particularly if you actually notice that the scale is about a tenth of the scale that I had on the previous graph. This is that exotic place known as Norway. And so I now want to think about renewables in an energy market where it really is megawatt hours rather than megawatts in a power market. And so marginal cost, but of course the cash marginal cost of water and demand at a price, cash marginal cost of water is basically zero. So I'll put in the marginal cost like that, and we measure demand now in that direction. But there's a certain amount of resource available in a couple of periods, and anything we use now we can't use tomorrow. So there's remaining resource, and there's future demand measured in the other direction. If you're not happy thinking about the graph in sort of the wrong way round, go into that room and look through the wall, it'll be the right way round. And that future demand, of course, is really the opportunity cost, which is a sort of marginal cost. And so we get a price. And credit where credit's due, this is, of course, Finn Fawcent's bathtub. And that's how energy markets, as opposed to power markets, work. And the reservoir level, if it's going up, you need a low price to minimize the risk you're going to have to throw energy away if you reach full capacity. If you're draining it, you have a high price to minimize the risk of actually running out, and then perhaps you go into a cycle of refill and the price is low again. And basically, all of this period, the price would be about the same. All of this period, the price would be about the same, potentially a lot less volatile. And indeed, if I go back to the same renewables, same demands, but now nuclear stations, also pretty well zero marginal cost, and the price is set by the need to ration, it's pretty flat compared to what we had with the same renewables but lots of gas. If I have a high renewable week, again, pretty flat price compared to what I had before. And if I look at the revenue levels, everybody now gets much closer to the average price than in what I was calling the thermal market, the power market. So it's potentially a much less volatile place to be. Now, we would have long-term storage, which I had in at 80% efficient, drains during the winter, bumbles around a bit in the spring, and then in the summer it refills itself, ready to drain again in the winter. Note that I need 18 terawatt hours. That is quite a lot of vehicles to grid. Or it's 20% of Norway if we could put in a few cables. Might be quite a few cables, but I'm not sure it's impossible. There's also some short-term storage, which to see properly I have to change the scale. It goes up and down a lot. And then the prices are very much, if the long-term storage is discharging, this is the energy coming out, then the price is higher. If the short-term storage is charging, the price is a little bit lower. Long-term storage discharges, price goes down. Short-term storage is charging around that long-term discharge, and the price goes up a little bit. And I can get the pattern over the year doing roughly what I said there. So this is a world in which things are doing, a possible economic model for the future. The model is far from complete. All sorts of engineering things have been left out. It's sort of perhaps slightly appropriate that things that I've left out can't get onto the slide. But yeah, I'm not doing balancing or uncertainty or transmission or the distribution or inertia. I think there's a bit of inertia in this system. And perhaps more importantly, because from an economic treatment, I haven't yet really looked at what happens with an intermediate amount of storage, enough to get some of the volatility out, but not all of that. So there's still some work for me to do. But to conclude, if we have power markets, we are going to get some very volatile prices. Storage can shift us to energy markets, which ought to be less volatile. It's the energy constraint that then binds. And I suspect we'd then be valuing generators, what is the value of a PV panel or of a battery, on their expected energy output over a period of time, rather than their power. And I've been very, very naughty. I keep using my business school's old brand template because I've just got far too many complex slides in it, and I actually prefer it. But I'm sure the brand police would prefer me to show you the new one. Thank you very much. Where am I? Who am I?
Thank you very much for this presentation. Now we will have time for a few questions to our presenters. Here's the first one, please. Okay.
This question is for Ben. Ben, you didn't talk a lot about vehicle-to-grid, grid-to-vehicle, joint battery use. And that's always been a topic, at least in the U.S. And there's also the potential for vehicle-to-home, home-to-vehicle. They both take about the same kilowatts for operation. So what is your view about the potential for using vehicle batteries either to support the grid or to support individual consumers at home?
Thanks, John. Is this on? This is on. Yeah, in fact, in my class, we cover a good deal of vehicle-to-grid, good ideas. I think in looking at it in the fairly short term, vehicle battery manufacturers, particularly Tesla, will not allow it. And they'll not allow it because the tech is changing so quickly. They just don't have a good sense of what the impact is going to be with a different pattern of charge and discharge. In a mode of using the battery to supplement power in the house or a vehicle to grid. So the only near-term option is really to essentially match the vehicle, the vehicle's battery fill points to values and costs in the distribution system. For example, if we have a time of day pricing, as we do, on the meter for the car, we simply set the timer for midnight. And it takes maybe 3 or 4 hours to charge, and so we're charging at the right time for the utility. The utility can't force that; they can send a strong economic signal, but the idea of discharging it into the house, not yet. But it's not far off. For example, I guess Tesla and I think one other manufacturer also have a wall battery that essentially is the same basic piece of equipment. But it's used in a cycling mode at a small scale, not 100 kilowatt hours, maybe 10. But at least there's a start. So ultimately, I think it's going to happen. It's a great, rich problem. Is really rich with interesting, analytic questions.
Here we have
Thank you.
additional questions.
My question is for Richard Green. Is it possible that to incentivize efficient investments in storage without scarcity prices?
I think the simulations that my colleague Goran Strabak at Imperial has done suggest that actually a lot of the value from storage comes from reserve, and particularly fast responding reserve. And depending on where you put it, it can also come from being in the right place to discharge when a piece of grid equipment would otherwise risk being overloaded, and therefore you build storage rather than building another transformer, say, and you could get the network company to pay for that. And so the energy arbitrage revenue, which is what economists find easiest to model, is often the least important part. One of the issues is that those revenue streams potentially come from different organizations, and organizing it all becomes more interesting, particularly if you're in a world that doesn't believe in fully integrated system operators. In a hemisphere that doesn't believe in them.
Here we have 2 questions.
Jakob Wachsmuth from Easy. I have 2 questions, one for Richard and one for Reinhard. So the one for Richard is, closely related to the one before, but it's about the seasonal storage. So what do you have in mind for the seasonal storage, and why do you expect it? Why do you expect that the revenues might be enough in the situation where you don't have very low prices of electricity anymore for seasonal storages? And the one for Reinhard is, you talked about having high prices as a signal for flexible generators to stay in the market. But what about new capacity? Have you also checked that in the long term till 2050, new capacity will be needed? And is the risk for building it not too high for this very small amount of hours with very high prices?
Richard.
Okay, I could start with the answer to the last question. I have shown exactly what is the condition for a generator to stay in the market, and we had on the right-hand side of the equation the capital costs for a year and also the operation and maintenance costs. So I think the same condition in principle applies for new power plants. So if you intend to build a new power plant with a much higher efficiency, then it could be of interest with the same condition as I have shown, and this has also been presented in Richard's graphs, that might be an economic opportunity, financial opportunity to gain revenues and to be profitable. But of course, this will be maybe for 1 or 2 generators compared to a large number we have currently, and it will of course be different in every single market. It will depend on the conditions in the markets, as a joint price zones, for example. The larger the area is, the better are the conditions, as I already explained, and this is also influenced by grid issues. So if the more barriers you have in the grid, the less large is this area which is attractive for a potential new generator.
In terms of a particular technology, I was, in a sense, waving a magic wand to create a black box full of phlogiston. And so I didn't have anything specific in mind. Potentially for seasonal storage, it might be things like compressed air, or I think the most practical one in the UK situation would be if the Norwegians were willing to talk to us after Brexit, and if the Brits were willing to talk to other Europeans after Brexit, cables across the North Sea where lots of water storage exists already. That would be plausible. But I was running simulations to make sure it actually solves, because it takes quite a long time for that model to run, and not putting in any binding capacity limit. So the difference between in and out prices was simply my assumed efficiency. In practice, you would have less storage. You would, I think, need to get to the point where there was less storage. There was also an energy constraint between the in and the out prices, and so the difference between the price at which you got money in and the price at which at which money flowed out when charging was big enough to cover capital costs. So I certainly haven't got to a full equilibrium model yet.
Okay, we can take 1 or 2 additional questions. Here we have 3. Okay, let's take these 3 and then we'll close the session.
Just a brief follow-up to the previous question to Richard. Christoph Weber, University Duisburg-Essen. Obviously, I understand that the British would like to connect to Norway. The Germans also would like to connect. What do you expect in terms of competition? And perhaps also the Norwegians would like to continue to use some of their 80 terawatt hours for own purposes. So competition tends to be hard.
Maybe we can hear also the last 2 questions and then have an answer.
Yes, I have a question for these 2 gentlemen that are presenting economics. I was a bit surprised that you, Mr. Green, have a presentation of price volatility, and there is no peak down. That's maybe the most interesting risk question for the moment, when the prices becomes severe negative. what happens? I think it's with this flexibility in production, and you have a lot of wind in the system, you can actually destroy the whole pricing system.
Okay, the last
Comment on that, please.
Okay, the last question.
Carsten of DIW Berlin. To Reinhard and Richard, I was impressed by both of your clear arguments for the energy-only market, and I think a comment is to add something on the forward contracting to further kind of stabilize the revenues. But the question that I think particularly Richard's presentation was raising, is the constraint that our systems will be facing really going to be the capacity in terms of megawatts at the peak, or is it going to be more of something like the thermal capacity or energy capacity in the storage? How many megawatt hours, for how many hours can it store? And what does this imply for any countries that are still considering capacity markets right now fully focused on the old paradigm of megawatt peak?
Thank you.
Well, as Carsten knows well, the Brits change their market every 10 years or so, so it would take 10 years before there was significant amounts of storage in place. I think I am actually still agnostic on capacity markets. If anything, what I was saying was I'm not sure the need for a capacity market, if there is one, becomes stronger with renewables than it was before. It certainly has potential to reduce risk, but it's probably better if it's the reliability option kind of market, which really does do some hedging, as opposed to the additional revenue stream market. In terms of the negative prices when power is being thrown away, the sequence of time would be several months or a year in advance. Baseload generators will be selling their expected output at a price linked to the expected average price over that period. Then day ahead, we will discover that it's quite windy. People who need to top up will realise there's a chance that if they have imbalances, they might actually be paid to get rid of them, and so the price day ahead would be lower. Might even get to the point of negative, at which point nobody with a choice would be offering any additional power, and some would be cutting back. And then in real time, or very close to real time, National Grid pays some wind generators to turn down their turbines, and that becomes the negative price in those particular hours. That will go into the balancing price calculations, so people who are actually taking more than they expect, or people on the other end of flexible interconnectors, will think it's Christmas. They get paid for taking more power or producing less. And those who are demanding less or producing more are in trouble. But basically, wind turbines get turned down in order to make sure that the frequency still stays roughly at 50 hertz. And small amounts of energy or power actually receive negative prices, but the expectation of those negative prices goes into the forward trading and helps set the revenue streams, which, as long as people are still building baseload plants on the expected ability to recover their costs, anchors the baseload price you'd get.
Richard, can I tag on to this? You are basically, in a sense, suggesting that the clock in the electric vehicle does the clock doesn't get set to a 24-hour clock. Somehow it gets set to the futures market, in anticipation of negative pricing.
Yes, if smart charging that can work out when it's best to charge the grid would be better. And in terms of Norway having lots of people wanting to use their water, I haven't checked the hydrology. When do they have water available? And that could be one of those moments when I discover it's not a realistic option because they need to be reloading at the same time as we do. Mm-hmm. Or it could be one of those very nice ones where you actually get a very complementary pattern.
So we are running.
Research is needed.
I would just
Maybe
like-
just one last statement from Reinhard.
Last comment is on storage. I think we have to consider that every battery and every hydro storage is a short-term storage. And usually all these storages, regardless whether they are in Norway or Austria, are empty at the time they are urgently needed. And we do not yet have proper solutions for real long-term storage. We talk about hydrogen, about green methane, but we are far away from a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thanks to all speakers as well as you for your contribution. Coffee break has started. I just want to tell you that you can use opportunity to vote to the bus paper today until 4:30. Use this opportunity. Thank you very much.